Hello, and welcome to Climate Fix Podcast. Here we dive into evidence-based solutions to climate change and various other pressing environmental issues. This podcast is created by Americans for Nuclear Energy, a pro-nuclear environmental organization. We take no money from industry or special interest groups. All donations are from individuals like you, interested in a grassroots scientific movement to solve the world's most pressing scientific problem, global climate change. We hope you approach these ideas with humanism and an open mind. Our mission statement is as follows. Nuclear energy is safe, cheap, plentiful, clean, and efficient. It has the capability to stop and reverse climate change while addressing the ever-growing demand for electricity globally. We strive to educate American citizens about this technology and to dispel misconceptions with facts. We firmly believe that both human civilization and industrialism can easily coexist with a healthy environment. Join us in helping to plan a prescription for a feverish planet, or as we like to say, a climate fix.
This is your host, Phil Ord. This episode of Climate Fix Podcast is called Shutting Down Our Future. Our format is a little different this time around, as we do not have an outside guest joining us. Instead, A&E team member Colby is joining me in conversation, talking about nuclear power plant closures in the middle of a climate crisis. We plan on getting into the details about the last unit of Indian Point nuclear plant in New York being shut down, and the unknown future of Byron and Dresden nuclear plants in Illinois. Closures of nuclear power plants are always followed by increased emissions and local economic downturn, and we simply cannot afford to let it continue to happen. The Biden administration is aware of this problem and may consider taking steps to help stem the tide of plant closures. We will then talk about the absolutely terrifying nationwide heat waves in late June and early July, being especially bad in the Pacific Northwest. Temperature records were shattered and extreme heat unleashed all sorts of mayhem, including hundreds of deaths. Global warming is here now and is not some distant future threat. All this extra heat trapping from carbon emissions is setting us up for a lot of turmoil ahead. As a society, we must act decisively and move from fossil fuels to fission as fast as we can. This will be a rather serious episode, talking about some sobering numbers. Please note that we are not trying to scare anyone. We just want to solve a serious problem and offer a serious solution. Those who are unserious about climate change are those who keep arguing against nuclear power. Carbon emissions and climate change are worsening as a direct result of those who seek to delegitimize a more than valid carbon-free energy technology. Many keep bringing up the cost argument and claim nuclear power takes too long. These arguments were never legitimate, as most of these problems arise from anti-nuclear sentiment to begin with. We have real-world examples of affordable nuclear power that was implemented quickly, like in France. It's time to be on offense and not on defense in advocating for nuclear power. The anti-nuclear crowd is getting in the way and destroying our planet. Closing nuclear plants and refusing to build new plants during a climate emergency is indicative of an absolute policy failure. It's also an example of pervasive denial of science at a societal level. We need change in the direction of nuclear support and scientific literacy. That is what this episode is all about. We are fed up and need to get the message out there and stop the insanity. Nuclear is needed to fight climate change. Full stop, non-negotiable. Losing gigawatt after gigawatt of clean nuclear with polluting gas is not acceptable in our opinion. Let's stop shutting down our future. Without any more delay, here is our conversation. Hey, Colby, welcome back.
Hey, always happy to be here.
Well, let's dive right into our discussion, talking first about the unfortunate closure of Indian Point.
Yeah, the closure of Indian Point Unit 3 is, recent tragic news in as far as energy and climate change is concerned. This massive loss of power is basically going to get replaced by natural gas. And we've known this. We've been advocating about this. We've been trying to inform people that when you shut down nuclear power plants, it doesn't get replaced by wind and solar. It gets replaced by gas. And even though a region can build out wind and solar after that, the real agenda should have always been replacing fossil fuels with anything that's not fossil fuels. But that's clearly not what we've been seeing from the anti-nuclear movement. They are more concerned with shutting down nuclear power than they are with shutting down fossil fuels. And the actual consequences of their actions can really be seen just in the grid data directly. And Indian Point is another example of this. And so just to go over some numbers, Unit 2 was shut down back in April of 2020, and Unit 3 was shut down in April of this past year, 2021. Now, this tremendous loss of carbon-free power was basically a little over 2 gigawatts of installed capacity, and both of these units produce an average of 17 terawatt hours per year. To give you an example, that's more than the entire electrical consumption of both Vermont and New Hampshire combined, which is about 16 terawatt hours of electricity consumed. Now, when it comes to Indian Point provided enough electricity to power 2 million homes with both units running, and it accounted for about 13% of New York's electricity, New York State. So the absolute increase of natural gas that is resulting from this is going to increase the carbon intensity of the electricity in New York. So some calculations done by the group Environmental Progress shows that the carbon intensity for electricity generated in the state of New York in May 2019, when the units were running, was about 119 kilograms per megawatt hour. In April 2021, the intensity was 174 kilograms per megawatt hour. So the closures were almost entirely replaced by natural gas. And, some could say that was actually part of the larger agenda of the fossil fuel industry, even if they're saying they're going to replace it with renewables. And, as far as the grid data is concerned, the merchants of fossil fuels would be very happy with the closure of Indian Point, because between May of 2019 and May of 2021, the total share of the electric grid increased 14% in fossil fuels, while decreasing about 12% in nuclear and 2% in wind. So, when you have wind capacity, it's doesn't matter of how much the actual weather can determine how much energy you're actually generating that year, regardless of whether your installed capacity changes. So
it was just a straight up 1-to-1 replacement of carbon free to carbon intensive. You're right. It feeds right into the, to benefit the fossil fuel industry. And there is some weird corruption with the governor of New York, Governor Cuomo. And Environmental Progress did some work on kind of looking into some of this stuff. And there is this company called Competitive Power Ventures. They gave to the Cuomo gubernatorial campaign in 2009, and they gave $75,000. They wanted to secure the future of the CPV, which is Competitive Power Ventures, CPV Valley Energy Center, which is a 650 megawatt natural gas plant. And it was looking to get a $100 million 15-year power purchase agreement with the state.
Wow, that's that plant's going to be cranking out a lot of power after Indian Point goes down.
And I don't think it's just that one. There's a brand new plant they built, which is called Cricket Valley. I believe it's by the same people, but it's also like 2/3 of a gigawatt of power. So you can see where they built the new power plant and everything, and it's just sad. And here's another bit of kind of sketchy bedfellows. So the former aide of Cuomo, his name was Todd Howe. He worked with CPV to push for closing for Indian Point, and as early as 2010, Howe worked with the then current aide for Cuomo, Joseph Percoco, to influence the former state operations director to close down Indian Point and to get support for Valley Energy Center, which he promoted as being union supported. When nuclear power plants have stronger and more robust unions, that's for sure.
Yeah, I mean, unions can also be, like electrical workers could work on a gas plant for one contract and, a nuclear plant for the next contract. But yeah, I mean, unions are employed, all across the energy sector, but nuclear is certainly one of the stronger parts of that.
For sure. And I mean, this kind of blatant corruption got the attention of U.S. Attorney in Manhattan, Preet Bharara, and he filed a criminal indictment in 2016, concluding that the importance of the plant to the state depended on Indian Point being shut down.
Wow. And if you have attorneys sort of looking into what you're doing, that's certainly suspicious right there.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I know this was one of the pretty big scandals of the governor's career, and we all already know he's kind of a sleazebag too, because a lot of other stuff came out with sexual harassment charges, not trying to tarnish his character, but slimy people at play here. And then here's another story. So his campaign manager for his latest, re-election campaign in 2018, he hired this woman named Maggie Horan, and she's a lobbyist for a natural gas pipeline company called Transco. Not at the time when he hired her, but previously. And this company, Transco, was aiming to build a pipeline between New Jersey and New York. So that was kind of an issue. He got some flack from the other lady running, Cynthia Nixon, I believe, about that pipeline. So,
and that's fossil fuel money.
For sure, it's just kind of weird that a fossil fuel gas pipeline lobbyist became his campaign manager. And just so we all know, Transco, it's a subsidiary of the Williams companies, and they donated $100,000 to a Democratic Party governor's organization that supported Cuomo.
Wow. So it's, we have the revolving door of fossil fuel lobbyists, and, they go work for the fossil fuel industry, then come around, go work in offices of government, which can then shut down, the competition, which is nuclear. And here we also have the same companies just dumping money into the campaigns of politicians who are also enemies of nuclear and trying to shut down these nuclear plants. And, they might say what they're going to say about, it'll get replaced by renewables, but ultimately, it gets replaced by gas. And even if we could replace Indian Point with renewables, that should have never been the plan to begin with, because as long as the grid is dominated by fossil fuels, as long as there's fossil fuels on the grid, if we care about climate change, if we care about cutting back on pollution, we should be targeting any replacement of, target fossil fuels for replacement, not targeting nuclear.
Yeah, and I also found it kind of annoying because he also pushed for banning fracking in the state of New York. Well, that's basically saying, well, I'm not going to crap where I eat, but I'll still, continue to rely on natural gas and, support it.
Import it. That's what that pipeline's going to be for.
Import it from, heck, I think even some places in the Northeast import from Russia.
There's been a few newspaper headlines I've read about that, and yeah, because we get them in from big tanker boats, and I guess some people did the work and they followed the gas, and we're not supposed to be importing directly from Russia, but the gas can land in another port between Russia and here, get loaded onto tanks, and then load it back onto another tanker and shipped over here. So
thank you, Jones Act.
Yeah, there's a few news articles about that happening in the last 10 years. But on this argument that I often see from the anti-nuclear movement, they say, don't worry about shutting down. We're going to shut down the nuclear, but don't worry, it'll be replaced by solar and wind. But this is just absolutely ridiculous when you look at the grid data. So when it comes to Indian Point 2 and 3, just one of these units, the amount of electricity they generate is more than the total amount of electricity generated from solar and wind in New York. So combined together, it's 2.5 times the output of all statewide solar and wind. And so, they say, yeah, we'll replace it with solar and wind. Well, the initial amount of solar and wind would not have even replaced one of them. And that's given all the time that New York has had to build up solar and wind infrastructure. And there's a pretty good graphic provided by nuclearny.org. And it's basically shows you side-by-side comparisons of what the losses of Indian Point 2 and 3 would mean compared to how much solar and wind electricity generation there is.
And that's taken right from NYISO too.
Oh yeah. The grid data is what I always look to rely on when it comes to testing the claims of the anti-nuclear movement or any outlet claiming to advise good energy policy. Like what does the grid data actually show?
Right, and they undid all of their solar and wind twofold.
Oh yeah, and so the question is, was Indian Point due for closure? Because the anti-nuclear movement have been banging that drum for a while. They try to say that about all plants, and there's this persistent lie that I noticed, and I'm sure many of our listeners also notice, is just because the NRC will license a new plant that just opened up for 40 years, that's standard regulatory practice, give it a 40-year license, that does not imply the actual lifetime of the plant. That is just the first license. And it's pretty routine, assuming everything's going well, that you can get that license extended 20 years after the 40-year period. And there's regulatory pathways for that too. And some plants are even extending that another 20 years and going 80 years we haven't gotten to the point where anyone's been applying for a 100-year license yet, but many people in the industry don't see a problem with that either. So the question is, how long could Indian Point have gone without without aging out, just based on actual technical deterioration. And so just on the regulatory side, the application for a license extension was filed successfully. And the NRC was relicensing it for another 20 years, starting in for Unit 2, 2013, and Unit 3 for 2015. And so just on that relicensing extension alone, we could have had an Indian Point running, at least another 10 years out from, or these two units, at least another 10 years out from the current time. So that would have been, if we do the math, 17 terawatt hours a year, 170 terawatt hours of clean electricity that we just basically sabotaged. And that's now going to get filled in with fossil fuels for the time being.
For sure. That's shameful.
Absolutely. And, but yeah, and, that's thinking long-term, thinking climate, thinking pollution. But the fact that we have taken off 2 gigawatts of dispatchable power that can run nonstop. And we saw the headlines this past year. Climate change is changing the climate, changing the weather. We're getting hotter summers. And we saw New York City and the government, the state government actually tell people, hey, we know it's a heat wave, but please, keep your ACs, use your AC sparingly. Don't use that much electricity. There's now a electricity shortage on the grid following the closure of these units. So that brings up a list of problems, not just that we're losing carbon-free electricity, but we're losing electricity in general. And heat waves are no joke. Like it's not just that we feel uncomfortable and sweaty and groggy during them. It's that heat waves can actually be deadly, and they have been deadly this past year.
Definitely.
And it's absolutely infuriating to see that these anti-nuclear NGOs spread all of these misleading statements, all these false claims about nuclear energy, make all these promises about how the grid's going to remain stable and it's going to be fine and it'll be replaced by renewables. And it gets replaced by gas, and we run into energy shortages right after that unit gets shut down. And
Right.
other people pay the price, and it's very tragic that if we have rolling blackouts in the middle of the summer, it can be just as fatal as rolling blackouts in the middle of the winter. Heat waves can kill people just like cold spells and deep freezes when you don't have electricity running to your house. So it's a serious issue.
And when temperatures, start to reach, 100 degrees or almost reach it, when it's in a part of the country where that's not very common, yeah, it's gonna cause a lot of problems. It's gonna piss a lot of people off too. And we all know that heat makes everyone more angry too.
It does. I'd be curious to actually look up scientific studies on rates of violent crime during heat waves. That'd be an interesting thing to look up. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I'll I'm taking a note of that.
Yeah, and it's the widespread blackouts they had in Brooklyn. At the latest heat wave we had at the end of June, they might have not had blackouts if Indian Point was still running. So
2 gigawatts makes a lot of difference on the grid. That's for sure.
Definitely.
You can run a lot of air conditioners off 2 gigawatts.
You can say that again. So yeah, that's the unfortunate end of Indian Point. Hopefully they don't dismantle it too quickly. Maybe there's a way to resurrect it. Who knows? Probably not though. But
engineers could do it. The question is, would politicians let them?
Exactly. That's true. Let's just get a bunch of outlaw engineers and just take it over and be like, we aren't going to let this electricity go without a fight. But and Indian Point could be just the beginning of even more. Like we've lost another big reactor we lost before. Indian Point was the second unit of, was it Unit 1 or Unit 2? It was one of the units of 3 Mile Island. That was also a gigawatt. And it's just starting to get, instead of losing the small plants, we're starting to lose the gigawatt ones too.
Yeah.
And especially the future is very uncertain for some of the power plants in Illinois. And Illinois is one of the highest nuclear powered states in the country.
It is.
Yeah, like half of Chicago's energy is nuclear. I mean, electricity or something like that. Yeah, I could be wrong on that exact number, but it's a lot.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure, the whole state is in the neighborhood of 50%, if I'm not mistaken.
Right. So these two plants, Byron plant and Dresden plant, each one are about 2 gigs, if I'm not mistaken. I think so. So Exelon in late August 2020, so last year, said that it would close Byron and Dresden nuclear plants in the fall of this year, unless it gets a change in state law to subsidize the plants. They claim they can no longer operate at a profit in the face of falling energy prices and competition from fossil fuel plants. They're looking for like a small increase in the amount of subsidy for it to kind of showcase its carbon-free attributes, but that takes legislative change to get that going.
Absolutely.
And this closure would eliminate for Byron and Dresden only would eliminate 1,500 full-time jobs and reduce work for about 2,000 supplemental employees that are brought in during the refueling. And so together, these two plants account for 30% of Illinois' carbon-free energy output, electricity output. It's
Electricity.
Electricity, okay.
Yeah.
Not all energy, but
You say energy, you have to count the gasoline and automobiles
exactly,
and all that.
right. Yep.
But that's still a lot. That's still very substantial because there's a lot of people live in Illinois. It's got Chicago, you know?
Oh yeah, and it's, I think a few years ago they did pass a clean energy standard for two plants, Clinton and Quad Cities. But there are 4 plants that aren't covered under this, which is Byron, Dresden, LaSalle, and Braidwood. And losing all those plants, I mean, we'll get into that later. If we don't take care of those plants, that's going to be just huge swaths of carbon-free energy gone. But there has been, an effort to get more of these plants on these like clean energy credits. So an example of this is the Climate Union Jobs Act, which was introduced to this, Illinois General Assembly, and it would create 74 million megawatt hours of carbon mitigation credits to facilities including Byron, Dresden, LaSalle, and Braidwood. So all 4 of these Byron and Dresden are planned to close if nothing happens, but we could also lose Braidwood and LaSalle if they aren't covered either. So this bill had hopes of being passed before the end of the legislative session in May 31st, but the bill was not passed in time, and it's kind of in limbo right now.
Wow. I mean, I just looked it up, and to clarify, Dresden is its nameplate installed capacity is about 1.8 gigawatts roughly, and then Byron is about like 2.3 gigawatts in that neighborhood. So yeah, they're average them out, and they're basically two gig plants each, and that's pretty significant. It's pretty concerning to know that like all of these plants are threatened for closure just because natural gas is cheap and politicians just don't really care about the climate when they say they do. Because if they did, it'd be like keeping nuclear plants open and doing everything we can to keep them open and running.
And a lot of it has to do with, there are the zero carbon energy credits, or there are also the renewable energy credits. And if you don't have a, carbon-free energy credit, then you basically are saying, I'm leaving nuclear out of the situation.
It's it's so broken. The like watching how biomass plants that are basically they're either burning garbage or burning forests, wood or crop waste, or just very low energy density biomass material. And the ones that get credits for burning garbage, like only about half the carbon that goes into a waste incinerator is actually from biomass. The other half is like petrol products. But they get these renewable energy credits as if that's going to mean it's good for the climate. But nuclear is left out of so many of those deals, as you said. Where if we have zero emission credit, like that would make a lot more sense. That would include nuclear, and maybe there could be some legislative debate over whether biomass even deserves to be part of that equation, because it's still emitting carbon, despite the accounting tricks that keep it on the table and keep it in play. So the fact that these plants rely on government bills of special subsidies or special conditions where politicians have to either care enough about the climate or know enough about how important nuclear is really frustrating, because if we're losing nuclear plants, it's not just that, we're losing carbon-free electricity, carbon-free power. What would that do to Illinois if it lost, 4 gigawatts of dispatchable baseload power within a year? That's terrifying, especially with climate change happening, especially with, the summers getting hotter, the winters getting colder, the extreme weather events kicking up.
We're going to need more power on reserve.
Absolutely.
When these things happen in the future.
We're going to need nuclear power plants to power air conditioners. We're going to need them to, displace, like power our civilization in an increasingly destabilizing climate. And, are they going to be able to even build enough natural gas plants fast enough? I'm not even going to entertain the idea of, building renewables. But are there plants that can really pick up this slack? Are there neighboring grids that can, offer imports? That's going to be a lot of math problems for the grid operators to figure out if these politicians don't get their act together on this.
Definitely.
And it's really a shame that, Exelon, I mean, I get it, they're a business. And, they're basically telling the politicians, the ultimatum, you either value nuclear energy, and provide what we need, or we're going to have to shut this down. So lawmakers held this special legislative session in mid-June to try again. Once again, the session adjourned with no deal. And much of the disagreement came from among the Democrats, and with, riffs with the environment, like the quote, self-proclaimed environmental activist. And I think just the way government works is, I think they're just going to hope that they put enough things in the same bill to make everybody happy, and hopefully that'll get passed in some, omnibus package or something. But that's going to be in the coming months.
Yeah, I guess the rift actually was like between some like people in like the labor unions for the nuclear power plants that were also Democrats that were at odds with the environmental activists. So it's kind of weird, the different, it's kind of interesting, the different, factors at play there for the different, groups of people that are supporting which thing. And it's like, I think that's interesting because a lot of the environmental groups like to say they're pro-work or pro-union, but then you see them fighting with people that were on that side of things. So
it's I don't even like to give them the direct title environmentalist. I just say self-proclaimed environmental activists, right? Because the real environmentalists support nuclear power. But I've testified at NRC hearings and stuff, and you'll see the room with all the labor union folks who are like, we work on this plant, we know the plant is safe, and then you'll get these like, a handful of anti-nuclear activists who have no idea how the plant works, and they just want to get up on the microphone and talk about why they hate nuclear. And it's always like, the union guys are actually working to keep that plant up and running and operational and safe and providing power for the community and the state. And, some anti-nuclear activists who give the same talking points over and over again, which are either like false or very misleading or irrelevant.
Definitely.
So What do you think, like, have you looked at the numbers and consequences that are forecasted if we risk losing Byron and Dresden?
Yeah, there's a group called the Brattle Group, and they commissioned lots of studies on energy and other economic issues. So Exelon, who runs the plants, has doubled down and says unless a bill is passed, they will shut down those plants. So we need to be careful like what that would do. So these are some insane statistics here, but so losing Byron and Dresden nuclear plants would cause a 20 million ton increase in annual CO2 emissions from the electricity sector in the state. The loss of the plants might lead to an electricity price increase of about $2.10 a megawatt hour, or $313 million a year, and lead to over 21 million tons more CO2 added to the atmosphere annually. We kind of said that above too. This undoes almost half the state's carbon emissions reductions since 2005. And let's say LaSalle and Braidwood plants also close, which would probably happen down the line if they don't get some sort of energy credit. It would undo all of the progress they've made since 2005.
Wow.
All of it. And Byron and Dresden both have a net summer capacity of about 4 gigawatts and annual combined generation of 35 terawatt hours.
Wow.
So that's a lot.
That's absolutely.
And so closing Byron, Dresden, LaSalle, and Braidwood, which are all, again, not subsidized under zero emission credits, would result in a net loss of like 3.46 billion in annual state GDP and 28,000 annual jobs, and which 4,200 of them are with the utility, and 149 million in estimated annual Illinois tax revenues.
That is, I mean, how can somebody read these numbers and think this bill was a good idea? You know?
Oh, well, the bill's trying to save it, though.
I mean, like not supporting this bill or like opposing the bill, like sorry, yeah, you're right. But so that's like the economic bombshell. Now, like what would these plants get replaced by? Like what's lined up?
So they have, they say 60% of this generation would be replaced by gas and 37% by coal based on increased outputs of other plants in the area.
Wow.
Yeah. So, and then here's a statistic you can get easier to kind of get your mind around. Getting rid of all 4 plants, if they got rid of it, would be like adding 10 billion cars to the roads. And it would be a 70% increase in power sector emissions for the entire state.
Wow. 10 million cars. And I mean, I'm just thinking that's
the magic of nuclear power, people.
Yeah. And, you know, a handful of reactors is holding back that much pollution, is holding back that many carbon emissions. And, you know, it's ridiculous that, you know, so many people insist on being so opposed to this technology.
Yeah, it's the true unsung climate heavyweight champion, you know.
So on the federal level, I'm really curious about how the Biden administration is going to deal with nuclear power. Are they going to be, you know, very supportive of it because it plays into climate goals and, you know, generally keeps up status quo and keeps the unions happy? Or is the Biden administration going to, you know, lean more towards what the anti-nuclear movement has been, you know, pushing for? And so right now, I know there are talks of, you know, special tax credits for nuclear plants to keep them running. And hopefully something like that does make it through Congress on a federal level. So if state governments fail to, you know, provide support for nuclear, then maybe there could be a federal program that could step in instead. And, you know, Biden does present pretty ambitious climate goals, and he's saying, you know, carbon-free electricity grid by 2035 and a carbon-free economy by 2050. Those claims, you know, it is a politician saying them. We would not be able to do that without nuclear. And unfortunately, we have these anti-nuclear activists, you know, who are saying stuff like bailouts for existing reactors are wrong for the climate and wrong for consumers. You know, Lucas Ross, program manager at Friends of the Earth, said that, and you know, we can remind everybody. Yeah.
To be fair, it is just Friends of the Earth. Like, they're kind of ridiculous. They're like the kind of the PETA of environmental groups almost.
So they're pretty anti-nuclear, and Friends of the Earth was an organization that was founded with money provided by somebody named Robert Orville Anderson, who was a pretty wealthy fossil fuel tycoon at the time, and you can look that up. There's been a few articles written about that.
Dang.
And with the anti-nuclear agenda, and keep the fossil fuel emissions going. So our nuclear fleet is under risk. One group, the Rhodium Group, which is a economic think tank, research institute who does this independent analytics and stuff, they issued a report on the state of clean energy in the U.S. and they basically came out and said, hey, if we don't put in policies to protect our nuclear fleet, if we don't actually value nuclear power in the economy or value nuclear power and what it can bring in the role of climate change mitigation, and we just keep going with the current policy framework and don't do anything to keep nuclear up and running, we'll lose half of the U.S. fleet by 2030. So, nuclear power is about 20% of our country's electricity right now. Seeing that go down to 10%, what's going to fill the gaps? There's so much harm that can come from that, whether it's pollution, carbon emissions, the increase in power costs, the jobs that will be lost, the communities that will be harmed who are basically dependent on nuclear power plants as their main economic powerhouse. It's going to be really tragic if we don't have politicians that value nuclear energy, for all the reasons that are quite valid in valuing this technology.
For sure. Yeah, that's a good 10% of our electric grid, that can just go away when there's no reason for it to do so.
And that's in the next decade. So Manchin wrote in a letter to Biden, as a zero emissions baseload fuel source, I believe that maintaining our fleet and preventing the closures of existing nuclear plants is critical to achieving emission reduction goals and ensuring a reliable grid. Basically saying what the scientists are saying, saying what the engineers are saying.
That's good. His bipartisan record is actually pretty based in that aspect. So
yeah. So so far, like what we're kind of observing is Biden seems to be like softly supportive of the existing nuclear fleet, but like I'd like to see action. I'd like to see that put down into law. I'd like to see that the checks being issued. I want to see these plants stay open. I'm not going to advance credit. I want to see these plants stay open. So
I wish they could publicly say something about this exact subject, but it's just still somehow a political boondoggle.
Yeah, and there is certainly a lot going on right now in the world. So, but climate change and these plants, like I'd really like to see some firm statements on this too.
Right, exactly. And I do think the administration is trying to push aside some of the unreason. Like there's some kind of wacky fringe environmental justice advocates that were advising the White House, and they wrote like a letter about sent a letter to lawmakers calling on them pursue a national standard requiring 100% renewable power by 2030, explicitly rejecting nuclear power. And this is a rebuttal to a policy favored by the Biden administration and top House Democrats and many more centrist environmental groups that called for carbon-free nuclear intensive power by 2035. So I think that they're kind of staying away from the more kind of radical, like kind of deep green type. Someone made this point that they're mad because you can't dismantle the system with nuclear power. It's kind of you're able to still run society with it. You know, you don't need to totally restructure everything. So I think they're staying. I'm glad it's in the direction of reason as far as I can tell. So
there were some pretty ridiculous things that were submitted to the Biden administration. I remember seeing one letter that got circulated. It boasted signatures from 600 environmental groups, but I started going through the list of signatories, and like some of these groups, it was just like one person. Like it's just their
right.
They run something. They run their own blog, and they call themselves a group, and like they might have a mailing list or something. But it's just like one. And the claims and the demands in that letter were ridiculous. They were even rejecting large scale hydro.
Right.
And so the only things they wanted were solar, wind, and small scale hydro. And it's like once you get rid of large scale hydro and you get rid of nuclear, like you're left with peanuts that require this fossil fuel dominated grid to keep stable.
Exactly. And that was the letter I was talking about. Like, and part of those kind of out there groups like, well, of course, Friends of the Earth and Center for Biological Diversity and the Indigenous Environmental Network, among hundreds of others. But like you say, like a lot of not even like Sierra Club and NRDC didn't even sign on to that. So that says something.
And I'm like, another thing, the letter was also criticizing biomass, which I understand, but like when you start saying you oppose large scale hydro, that's narrowing your support base even further, and it's a fascinating subject that I really wish got more attention in the media as far as shining spotlights onto this.
Yeah, for sure, but there was kind of a weird thing, and you'll get into that. But Gina McCarthy, who used to be EPA administrator, she who's also like the president of the Sierra Club right now, no, NRDC. She said some good things about nuclear, which is interesting.
Her quote was, in many areas, a continuation of the existing nuclear, as long as it's environmentally sound and it's permitted, is going to be absolutely essential because it will provide time to develop renewable energy into a bigger part of the energy mix. And I guess she said that at the Columbia University Center on Global Energy Policy, which is a virtual event on May 18th. And NRDC is a pretty anti-nuclear group. I think they teamed up with either Sierra Club or another. I think it was Waterkeeper Alliance, even worse.
Riverkeeper.
Riverkeeper, which is a subsidiary of Waterkeeper. But
okay.
They put this report together about Indian Point years ago, and they basically said, hey. We can start the closure process now because this is years ago, and it takes years to, from the signature to actual reactor shutdown, to build up renewable energy, to replace it or whatever. And of course, that didn't happen. But in the report that they authored way back when, they specifically stated that on the section on, would the grid become unstable? They even said we could repower. Let me get the quote out here. Our analysis shows that a wide range of options are available to make the transition to a safe, sustainable energy future of New York without Indian Point. These options include energy efficiency, renewable energy, such as wind and solar power, new transmission projects, and repowering old, inefficient, existing natural gas plants. All of these energy options could be implemented in the next 10 years, many even earlier. So this was a report commissioned by the NRDC. And, like when you have this quote environmental group who is advocating the closure of a nuclear plant and they're saying, hey, don't worry, we can replace it with gas. And this is, 10 years ago. And clearly with the amount of solar and wind in New York State, that never got built up nearly to to a fraction of what was actually needed to replace Indian Point. It's basically admitting like, all right, energy efficiency, new transmission projects. Yeah, where are they? Like we end up with natural gas. That's what we ended up with. And they said in their report that they were championing. So
thanks, Mark. Thanks, Mark Ruffalo, for not knowing what the hell you're talking about.
Oh yeah, the Hollywood celebrities. Yeah, and he came down in support of the Riverkeeper Alliance, who is Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s group, who's the notorious anti-vaxxer, who's getting a lot of attention now that the pandemic is still a problem, and he was also campaigning against Indian Point, and just general scientific, heuristic. If a notorious anti-vaxxer is championing your cause, you should really question your cause deeper.
Well, and he's on record actually. He's on record saying solar plants are gas plants. He said that
at a gas industry investor meeting years ago. Yeah, in fact, Rod Adams of the Atomic Insights blog has his YouTube channel. He keeps that video clip up on YouTube. You can Google it and find it and like see him, directly admit the scam that, hey, solar and winds, like they're really just gas plants. We want that gas pipe. He even said that too. So it's like, the ones at the top, they know what they're doing. They understand the full scam, but it's really tragic that people aren't smartening up to this fast enough, and we're losing these nuclear plants and ending up with all these extra carbon emissions and pollution. So, it's absolutely tragic.
Yeah, but there is some interesting hope inside. Like there's talk about that new infrastructure bill, and talk about that's one of the big things that they're talking about now is the infrastructure going through Congress, and that has some kind of cool nuclear stuff in there.
Yeah, it is interesting how nuclear is like, there is this interesting like bipartisan balancing act where it's like Republicans don't necessarily have a direct problem with nuclear in general. Moderate Democrats, not really, but it's not as divisive as an issue as so many other issues in politics are. There's like a kind of some opposition on both sides, some support on both sides, but in general, it is something that, hey, like our country needs infrastructure, our country needs energy, put this in. And so this, on July 14th, the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee advanced an energy bill that's expected to be part of the bipartisan infrastructure framework by a 13-7 vote. So that's hopeful. And this piece of legislation is expected to boost nuclear energy, hydrogen energy, and carbon capture. So at least there's progress on that front.
Yeah, that's good. And yeah, like you say, it's interesting bipartisanship, which will probably be the lifeline to nuclear in the future, I think. So
I sure hope so.
So let's kind of switch gears and get into the crazy climate behavior we have seen recently. So the Pacific Northwest saw some very alarming temperatures, to say the least. Portland, Oregon set an all-time record high temperature 3 days in a row, and that topped out at 116 degrees on June 28th.
Wow.
116 degrees in Portland, Oregon, people. Seattle hit 108 degrees, besting the all-time record it set just a day earlier. So this is one of the most scary things I saw about this was this small little town called Lytton, British Columbia. They registered 117.5 degrees on June 28 and topped out at 121.3 degrees on the 29th.
Wow.
That's the highest temperature ever recorded in Canada and that's around when it's about 48 degrees above what's normal for this time of year. Fires broke out, and the town of Lighton burned down. Like most of the dwellings were burned to the ground. So, I mean, that's crazy. A town burned to the ground because of these high temperatures, and not just with fires. Extreme heat is one of the deadliest consequences of climate change, killing more people than any other weather-related event. Heat deaths are probably also underreported because extreme heat contributes to more deaths other than things like heat stroke because they exacerbate other chronic diseases such as heart and lung conditions.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and all this weather was caused by what they call a heat dome, which is a strong ridge of high pressure that acts as like a lid on the atmosphere, and that lid traps the hot air trying to escape and warms it even more as it sinks. But
that's brutal.
Yeah, and I mean, there were deaths recorded. I'm not sure which article, but like this led to like a few hundred people like dying of heat-related illnesses.
I believe it, and it's really, it's something to really ponder and think about, because if you ask somebody, hey, what's the deadliest type of weather event, people think, hurricanes or tornadoes or, something with actual like newsworthy footage. But a lot of times people don't think of heat waves and right. The amount of, human misery and fatalities that can happen as a result of a heat wave. It might not make for like, shocking footage for the newscasters, but statistically that is a pretty significant thing to keep in mind, especially in, the age of climate change.
Yeah, definitely. And, it didn't just end at being really hot in Portland and Seattle either. Like there were some crazy things that happened.
Yeah, I remember seeing a map where it was just, it listed every county that had a new record high temperature recorded. And it was, like pretty much the majority of counties in the Pacific Northwest were all lit up. And, so through June 29th, at least 36 locations in the Western US and another 38 in Canada have tied or set all-time high records for temperatures among reporting stations since as far back as the 1960s.
As in, yeah, like that's the most current is they started recording back in the 60s, which is crazy. I mean, a lot of these records were started like way earlier than that, but I mean, like these are places that have like reliable records for many decades.
Oh yeah, and like as you said, this extreme heat, wildfires really thrive in these conditions when the wood and kindling and tinder dry out, and you're not getting like water to when all the water leaves the biomass. Like that is a pretty significant wildfire risk. So there's wildfires in British Columbia, Alberta, and these wildfires were so intense that they were generating their own thunderstorms known as pyrocumulonimbus and triggering evacuations. So like that's a very interesting weather phenomenon where you have smoke from these wildfires that have so much particulates in the air that they can actually create their own thunderstorm system.
Yeah, it's like you're driving past and like it's just like, Dad, what's that? Oh, it's just the firestorm lightning again,
Yeah, it's, comic book apocalyptic weather, but it's real and it's happening. And that high, like the June 29th high you mentioned on Lighton, British Columbia, that matched the high on the same day as Death Valley, California, which is known as, one of the hottest places in the U.S. And I don't know who does the accounting, but I do know Death Valley is often referenced as like the hottest place in North America. I'm sure, you know, there's different ways to do those counting, but
or even one of the hottest places on Earth.
yeah. So outdoor pools were closed in Seattle. Blueberries were cooked in the intense sun. Roads buckled in Western Washington. Vinyl siding warped. This is types of stuff that you might see in a town that you know, like had a wildfire run through it, but it's
Right.
just the intense heat that is doing this directly. And you know, this also has other indirect effects where if you have heat this intense and you have snow on mountains and the heat melts that snow at a very rapid rate, the snow melts can cause floods. And in some cases, the snow melt was so rapid that bridges were washed out in Mount Rainier National Park. So, you know, and Mount Rainier is near Seattle, and it's a pretty significant mountain. So there's indirect effects of this heat too. And I don't know if you saw the pictures, but the light rail power line installations were melting in Portland, shutting down public transit systems. So our infrastructure, our transit infrastructure directly is being impacted by this heat. And, you know, there's pictures of that on even the Portland Public Transit Facebook page was posting pictures of this installation that was melting. Now, near Canada's hotspot of, I don't know if it's Lytton or Lytton.
Lytton, yeah.
Okay.
Wait, I think it's Lytton.
Lytton? Oh, well,
Yep. Okay.
I'm sure somebody will correct us.
Yeah.
So fire crews couldn't battle away a wildfire by helicopter because the air was too hot and wasn't dense enough to allow the helicopter to hover. That's pretty significant. And
Yeah.
in Salem, Oregon, tied the Las Vegas record heat high of 117 degrees on June 28th. So it was as hot as Salem. It was as hot in Oregon as it was in Vegas. That is pretty ridiculous.
Their highest temperature in Vegas. Yeah, that's nuts.
And so the highest ever recorded temperature on Earth recently, and it was in Death Valley, California, at 130 degrees Fahrenheit on July 9th. And it was one of the hottest temperatures ever reliably recorded on the planet. And the temperature is tied for the hottest temperature reliably recorded on Earth, with with its own previous highest temperature from August of last year. So, you know, that's the data points are consistent every summer. It's just we're living on a planet that's getting hotter.
130 degrees.
And it's, yeah. I mean, near Death Valley, there's this town. I'm trying to think of the name of it. I think it's just Baker. And it's this town off the side of the highway. And their claim to fame is that they have the world's largest thermometer because it gets really hot out there. And I remember driving by that place. I stayed there once, and the thermometer went up to 130. And it's this big, 50-foot thermometer. It's a little tourist attraction to get a picture with. But now I'm wondering, like, are they going to have to update that thermometer? Are they going to have to, add another 10, 20 degrees even?
Right.
Because we're going to be living in a different type of planet with different conditions here. And I'm wondering, what's going to happen to our infrastructure? What's going to happen to our power grid with this extreme heat?
Are we going to have to live underground? Who knows?
There's towns in Australia where the people do that. It's cheaper to just build their houses underground and then pay for air conditioning to compete with that.
Jeez, yeah, it's just not set up for that. Like, one of the biggest things is it drives up energy demands, and you see these huge surges in electricity use because of the need for air conditioners, and too much, stress on the electric grid can lead to brownouts, partial outages, and like rolling blackouts, and because they had to reduce the amount of power on the system. High temperatures can also make plants less effective. They limit the amount of energy the power lines can carry, and make failures more likely in transformers, which these are things that help control the voltage throughout the power grid. Another example is if the weather gets hot enough, power lines start to sag, and that could, that's a result of the metal expanding inside them, and they can strike trees and start fires. Another one too is a lot of thermal plants require cooling with, water availability. And if we get to a point where there's not enough like water in reservoirs, that can become a problem too,
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure there's ways around that, because that's not saying that nuclear is doomed, but
yeah, a lot of plants are built on the ocean, and that seems to work. And Palo Verde gives me hope because they can run that pretty big. That's a pretty significantly big plant in the middle of the desert, and they're just using municipal wastewater. So I'm sure the engineers can figure it out if we're planning for it, right?
Right, and and the thing about nuclear is if you went full bore nuclear, you wouldn't need a bunch of like small gas plants like you would gas plants. You could just build a lot of large nuclear plants, so they'd be less likely to reach water shortages. But if you have these gas plants running, they do require cooling. So
yeah, the thermal power. And another engineering thing about solar PV is the hotter it gets, the electrical output of solar panels goes down. That's one other concern to keep in mind when it comes to solar panels. But of course, the bigger concern is the intermittency, and you have to fill in the gaps with fossil fuels in most cases. But
and so there were some power outages, and luckily not as many as could have happened. But an example was Spokane, Washington. They have about 220,000 people, and about 9,300 people lost power completely. And that's when temperatures reached 109 degrees. Also, the highest temperature ever recorded there.
Wow.
The high heat and high demand for power caused transformers to heat up, creating a danger of explosions. And problems were detected at several substation transformers. So basically kind of blew out some of the grid over there.
Wow, that's definitely a concern, because if those components will be vulnerable to the heat like this, then even if we have the generation capacity and the ability to dispatch it, our transmission infrastructure would also need to be able to weather this type of heat. So
the climate issue is here now, and it's scary, and we need some heavy hitter. Well, we know what that is. That's nuclear.
Yeah.
To really decarbonize the system we've got. And I'm starting, I don't know about you, but I'm starting to really get tired of the new, goalpost moving arguments against nuclear.
I still encounter people who will, share anti-nuclear content and make, some of the more recent anti-nuclear arguments that have been more popular is the economic, like they say, oh, it's just not economical, and they say, look at this LCOE, look at the levelized cost of electricity. The solar and wind are cheaper. Let's do that instead. And so they don't understand that there is this need to achieve deep decarbonization with our strategies. And if you read whether it's Lazard or whether it's the DOE or Department of Energy, any honest assessment of the levelized cost of electricity is going to be providing a statement on why it's problematic to compare dispatchable energy sources like nuclear with non-dispatchable energy sources like solar and wind. And this is the first issue I bring up with people relying on LCOE as the anchor of their argument. They even say, like, you can't do that because this LCOE is for investors who are looking to invest in energy generating assets, or if they're looking to understand what the costs are, where it's a single business entity. It's not a grand scheme, because if solar and wind cannot scale to deep decarbonization, which they can't, then they're not a solution. Therefore, it doesn't matter how cheap they are. It's not going to work. nuclear can scale to deep decarbonization. It's dispatchable. We can run it 24/7 if we wanted to. And that's just the first problem with using LCOE. The second problem is a lot of these reports, they'll say, oh, we're going to assume it's a 40-year lifetime for nuclear, or they start like there's so many variables and so many things you can input into the LCOE model that don't actually play out in the real world. And a nuclear plant can last a lot longer than 40 years. But they only want to count, the huge capital expenditure up front is only going to pay itself off over the 40 years. That's how they build these models. Where in reality, okay, sure, you're paying off the interest and that gets paid off, but it's still a cash cow after that. Like it's still operational after that. So all the electricity you're generating after that 40-year mark is still going to be like good to go. And doesn't have the capex costs tacked onto it under the LCOE model.
Yeah. The way I look at it, LCOE is like, sure, a solar panel farm can produce X amount of energy over its lifetime, but it doesn't, and it could do it technically if you just look at total energy it produced versus how much the panels cost. You could say, oh, that's pretty cheap. But if you produce the energy when you don't need it, or too much when you don't have the demand for it, it's intrinsically useless.
Absolutely, yeah. It's like, what's the value you're getting out of it? And there's also, like, I've read some of these reports where they are using some very favorable assumptions that are not realistic whatsoever. I remember reading one where they assumed the capacity factor for solar was going to be something like 33%, which I'm not aware of any solar installation that can get that. But unless they're doing some accounting tricks with the actual installed capacity being undercut and, whatever that might be. But, when people claim to be caring about the climate and we must do everything we can to stop the climate crisis, all of a sudden, a few more dollars in the megawatt hour on the cost basis is like, oh, we can't do that. That's that's sort of, it's this like contradiction that is just so apparent, but just they don't get it. It's like, we can't solve the climate crisis like that. Like that's.
It's like wind and solar. They're like, we could use a like 20 cent a kilowatt hour subsidy, but if nuclear asks for 2 more cents, that we're subsidizing that something that can't be subsidized. So it's just such a double standard. And they always will bring up the cost of like the new plants that are built, but the new plants that are being built are almost anomalies in how expensive they are, like compared to reactors being built in other countries and past reactors built in the United States. So
right. They say, oh, hey, look at Vogtle, look at Hinkley C, and something in general economics is you have the first of a kind builds and then you have the nth of a kind. So it's like the first time you try some ridiculously complex, like high impact projects with all new parts, everybody's on the job or building this thing for the first time, you're going to be making a lot of mistakes. You're going to be doing things inefficiently. You're going to be, at the same time, hopefully learning like how to do things better. And, like all the technical mistakes or all the things that need to be corrected along the way, all those get sorted out and added into the, build guide for the next one going up. And so we see, like
we're out of practice. And the reason why we're out of practice is because of the anti-nuclear sentiment to begin with.
Yeah. And, that as far as feedback loops go, like how much of the cost of current nuclear is a result of anti-nuclear sentiment. We have leaders of anti-nuclear groups even saying, hey, our strategy to kill nuclear power is just to keep the public afraid of it. And then we're going to use that to justify regulations that'll be put onto it that will add costs to the industry. And eventually it'll collapse under the high costs. And we have, one of the former presidents of the Sierra Club was saying that. And so there's their strategy out in the open. There's a reason nuclear is expensive. It's, or at least more expensive than it needs to be for sure. And, there's this other argument that's coming up now, and I'm sure you've seen it, Phil, well, we need to do something in the next 12 years, or we need to do something in the next 11 years. It takes 15 to 20 years to build a nuclear plant.
First of all, it doesn't take that long to build a nuclear power plant, and people are just like, oh, it takes 10 years to site the thing, or whatever. And I'm just like, you're just letting the bureaucrats win.
It and how long has the person who's making that argument been opposed to nuclear power? And how long have we been subsidizing solar and wind? And what has that done? So I like to bring up the graph where it shows France invested in nuclear in the 70s. What happened with those carbon emissions? And then Germany started investing even more money into solar and wind, and what happened with those emissions? Like, it's a pretty stark difference. And if we were building nuclear at the rate we were going in the 70s, at least in the US, or like France was going in the 70s and 80s, and Sweden was going in the 80s, there was one study that came out that actually said, hey, we could probably get the entire global grid off of fossil fuels for the most part in 25 years or so, just scaling out those build rates.
You just do nothing but build nuclear on time and on budget. Just keep cranking them out,
At the added generation per year per capita that we have already achieved in national build-out strategy, like the Mesmer project in France, where it's just hey, figure out a good design for nuclear power plant and build a lot of them, and build them in parallel. That's another thing. So they want to pretend that solar and wind can solve climate change and get rid of fossil fuels in 10 years, but that we haven't even seen that on the grid level, and on the actual build out rates for asset to asset, grid to grid, nuclear is always on top.
And if you do have to build them out and it can finally get them done and it takes a long time, you got to replace them again in like 30 or 40 years, because your panels and your turbines wear out.
That's being favorable, 40 years. But I mean, like there's some studies coming out saying like, hey, a lot of these wind turbines, they're failing after 16 years. And especially building stuff on the ocean, like salt water is no joke for big assets with moving parts.
Yeah, it's just another example of, again, moving the goalpost. If it's not Fukushima or Chernobyl, if it's not waste, now it's economics, and now it's we don't have enough time. And like you're the reason why we're in this point now where we have to go even faster. So I don't know. I sometimes feel like it's kind of like a victim abuser dynamic where it's like, they're blaming us for something that they caused.
Yeah. So that's a pretty accurate depiction. And I'd like to, when somebody brings that argument up, I like to say, well, do you support the closing of current nuclear plants? Because that's what all these green groups are doing, or like, I should say greenie groups, but they're championing the closure of nuclear power plants. Okay, so you're opposed to a nuclear power plant that's continued running, that's already built. Like, you don't have to wait the 20 years. It's still running right now. And that's when you start, they come up with another excuse of why they oppose nuclear, and they're okay with it getting shut down.
Well, and I get annoyed when they're just like, well, I'm not anti-nuclear, but I'm doing that. I'm just like, no, dude, you're finding problems with it. We should be trying to solve the problems that make it a little bit hard to do.
And if these anti-nuclear types actually looked into the problems that they raise, that they claim to be really concerned about, which I looked into these problems, and you find that actually engineers have figured out solutions to, if you want to define them as problems, well, there's been some amazing technological advances that has happened in the last few decades. And, there's some good news on the horizon.
Well, we've been talking about a lot of problems in this episode, but I think a lot of what we said needed to be, kind of laid out because of the rash of closures we are going to see if action isn't taken, and how that's just insane during a climate crisis. But there is some next generation stuff that's coming down the line, hopefully sooner rather than later. Bill Gates' TerraPower, they won a contract from the U.S. Department of Energy for $80 million in initial funding to demonstrate their natrium power plants. It's a sodium cooled. Natrium is the Latin, I believe, word for sodium. So that's why it's Na on the periodic table.
Interesting.
And so they're going to build a pilot plant in Wyoming. The idea was to basically build it at the site of a retiring coal plant. So that's a little bit of a poetic site to do it, replacing one of the filthiest sources of power with potentially the cleanest. And they've selected Wyoming to do this. And, the governor confirmed this on June 2nd. So that's exciting.
That is good.
This project features a 345 megawatt sodium cooled fast reactor. And it has a molten salt storage component to it. So you can basically have heat on reserve, if I'm not mistaken, to supplement other sources of power, like variable wind and solar. And so it can go up to 500 megawatts if you want it to for peak demand. And again, they always, when you do new projects, you tend to always over deliver on how much it would cost. But if it's successful and they could build lots of them, they would estimate maybe one of these plants could cost about $1 billion each, which would be infinitely better than some of the new plants we're building right now.
That'd be a capex of around $3 billion per gigawatt. That's awesome. That would be great if they could achieve that. And I love this project because not only is as you mentioned, it's like poetic justice for a retiring coal plant to become a nuclear plant. It's also smart on the business and technical side because you have generation assets there that there's steam turbines, there's infrastructure that exists that from the coal plant that was using a heat source, and was a coal furnace. And James Hansen and many other researchers have said, one of the fastest ways that we could transition from fossil fuels off of fossil fuels would be to just go into the fossil fuel plants and set up a program where you basically swap out the heat source, whether it's a coal furnace or it's be a few more steps with a gas turbine, but you have the transmission infrastructure already going there. You have certain parts of the plant that could be reused. You have the offices there, you have the infrastructure there, you have everybody who has their jobs there and their lives in that town, and you can keep it as a power plant. You just swap out the heat source
because the cycle's the same. No matter what the heat source is, it's just a thermal steam plant,
Yeah, and so if this can be pulled off, if this can be demonstrated, the fact that it's a fast reactor is also exciting because that means it's a lot more efficient at using uranium. And
it burns up all your transuranics. So
yeah,
I guess if that's right, correct me if I'm wrong. I'm not the biggest reactor nerd, but.
Usually it definitely higher on the fuel efficiency for sure. And the other thing is this molten salt heat storage. Not only is that going to be good for keeping up with the chaotic load generation patterns of renewables that are going to be on the grid, but in grids that don't have any intermittent renewables, just load following in general.
Right.
It's just like one thing the renewables crowd really does not like to hear, but it's the technical truth. Storage pairs better with nuclear.
Yep.
With solar and winds, like you can go 2-3 weeks with the combined solar and wind of a pretty built out grid being, an averaging under 10% capacity factor. And your batteries are going to be out over those 2 weeks. With nuclear, you're charging that thing up every night. So,
and if you can have a magic electricity machine that has no emissions and can load follow, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think we're done. We figured out how to do electricity without carbon emissions. It's not a puzzle anymore, right?
Yeah, and hey, if we can build one of them, and 345 megawatts, like that's sort of between the like giant capex like Vogtle size reactor, and bigger than the like pull it in on truck reactors. Although I don't know if they're designing these to be pulled in on a truck, but the fact that it's smaller means that will likely take less time to build up. And if we could just get a process going where if the folks at TerraPower can really engineer the process of building these things and get that more efficiently and get those costs down, we just you slapping these things out, building these out, and hopefully that does become this the vanguard, the leader of the actual decarbonization movement on the energy sector.
Yeah, and I'm just happy we're getting a reactor in my neck of the country. Colorado is just south of Wyoming, as everyone knows, the other square state. And so maybe I'll be able to go and visit them once they start building or something. But I really want to try to find someone at TerraPower to come on the podcast. That'd be really, really cool, I think.
Yeah, that would definitely make for a great episode. I'd love to learn more about that technology and the business and how things are moving along.
Well, we have been talking for a long time, so we don't want to keep any listeners getting bored of this. So I guess we'll kind of leave it there. Do you have any final words, Colby?
Well, yeah, I think there are big things happening this year in the nuclear energy sector. We're seeing the consequences of closing down plants. We're seeing the need for keeping the plants open, and we're seeing some new hope. We have TerraPower natrium reactors going up in Wyoming, hopefully, and local support there. So, yeah, overall, I think it's a worthwhile talk, and I think it's we covered a lot of things that were happening this year.
Yep. And stop shutting down perfectly good nuclear power plants during a climate crisis. Okay, folks? Let's just stop that.
I think our audience is in well agreement with that. All right. Well, thank you for tuning in.
We covered a lot, and our apologies for going so long on time with this one. Our hope is that we are getting the point out as clear as possible to many listeners. It is an absolute travesty to erase huge amounts of emission-free electricity from nuclear energy during a climate crisis. We have to get the carbon emissions problem under control, and the top priority of anyone concerned about global warming is to raise their voices in support of preserving our current nuclear fleet. These wonderful energy-producing machines are an indispensable asset and the biggest emission-preventing energy technology we have. Either we listen to science or we don't when it comes to solving this problem. The big question is, what do we do about nuclear power plant closures? One big thing is to contact your local U.S. House representative or your state senators to have a voice for nuclear in Washington. If you live in a state with nuclear power assets that are in danger of closing, contact your representatives in your state house. Go to Public Utility Commission meetings. Meet with climate activist organizations and attend functions and rallies. Tell your family and friends in person and online. If nothing else, we can peacefully and legally protest in the public square and outside the grounds of nuclear plants. We need to be vocal and sound the alarm, because not enough people are aware of the threat nuclear closures pose to the environment. Science and reason are on our side. Not doing anything we can to limit greenhouse gas emissions is wrong. Not giving people affordable energy abundance is wrong. Allowing companies to pollute the commons with impunity is wrong. We are choosing to stand up for what is right, even if it is unpopular. Climate change is probably the biggest issue facing our civilization, and puts in jeopardy all the progress society has made in human flourishing. We have so much at stake, and we must act. Saving nuclear power is critical to a livable future. Thank you so much for listening to this episode called Shutting Down Our Future.
If you like what you heard and want more content, you can support Americans for Nuclear Energy's Climate Fix podcast on a per-episode basis with Patreon. Link in the description. To support Americans for Nuclear Energy and our general mission, visit our website at www.americansfornuclearenergy.org. All words. Again, that's www.americansfornuclearenergy.org. We have a link to donate with PayPal under the Mobilize page. You can also purchase some Americans for Nuclear Energy swag under our store page. This will really help us pay for the little things, especially online service fees, to keep our organization running. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Tumblr, and YouTube. Lastly, we really want your feedback. Let us know your thoughts, questions, and concerns. We have a message form on our website under the About section, or you could email us directly at main@americansfornuclearenergy.org, all words. Again, that's main@americansfornuclearenergy.org. Thanks for tuning into this episode of Americans for Nuclear Energy's Climate Fix podcast. We'll see you next time.
Edited and produced by Jonna Adams.